In this video, we'll look at variance and standard deviation for grouped data. Here's a shortcut for sample variance and sample standard deviation for group data. S squared, the sample variance, is equal to n times the sum of f times xm squared, that's the frequency, times the midpoint for each class, minus the sum of f times xm quantity squared, all over n times n minus 1. And then for the sample standard deviation, we just, again, take the square root of that. Our process for finding the sample variance and standard deviation for group data is to first make a table, as shown, and find the midpoint of each class. So here is our table data. We're going to have the class, the frequency, f, the midpoint, xm, and then we'll have columns for f times xm and f times xm squared. Then we will multiply the frequency by the midpoint for each class and place the products in column D. We'll multiply the frequency by the square of the midpoint for each class and place the products in column E. We'll find the columns, the sums of columns B, D, and E. The sum of column B is n. We'll substitute in the formula and solve to get the variance. S squared is equal to n times the sum of f times x squared, xm squared, minus the sum of f times xm quantity squared, all over n times n minus 1. And finally, we take the square root to find the standard deviation. So as an example, we'll find the sample variance and standard deviation for the frequency distribution of the data shown. The data represent the number of miles that 20 runners ran per week. So first we're going to create the table. It's going to look at like this table, except we'll have columns for f times xm and f times xm squared, and we've already got the midpoints calculated in here. Then we will calculate the products of frequency and midpoint for each class. That's going to be 1 times 8 is 8, 2 times 13 is 26, and so on and so forth until we get to 2 times 38 is 76. And then we'll calculate the products of frequency and square of midpoint for each class. 1 times 64 is 64, 2 times 169 is 338, 2 times 38 squared is 2 times 1,444, which is 2,888, and so on. Then we find the sums of columns B, D, and E. So here is the final table. And we see that the sum of the frequencies is 20, which is as it should be, because we were told that there were 20 people that we were talking about. The sum of f times xm is 490, and the sum of x times f times xm squared is 13,310. And we plug all of this into our formula for s squared. So that's 20 times 13,310 minus 490 squared over 20 times 19 is 266,200 minus 240,100 all over 380. We subtract, get 26,100 over 380, which is about 68.7. Finally, we take the square root and find the standard deviation. Square root of 68.7 is about 8.3. There's our standard